our native land, our native land, our native, our native, our native land. Hi-ya, hi-ya, our native land.
Hey everybody, I'm Tchadas Leo. Welcome to another episode of Our Native Land. Before we get to today's guest, I would just like to do a territory acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory Czech Studio stands upon, and to all the nations that are part of the New Channel, Kwakwakak, and Coast Salish on Vancouver Island. I thank these nations and traditional land keepers for allowing us to live, work, and play on their lands. And I thank you, the listener and viewer, for tuning in to the show. Today, my guest is David A. Robertson. He's an Indigenous graphic novelist and writer from Winnipeg, Manitoba, of the Swampy Cree heritage. Robertson has published over 25 books across a variety of genres. David is the 2021 recipient of the Writers' Unions of Canada Freedom to Read Award. He's the author of numerous books for young readers, including When We Were Alone, which won the 2017 Governor General's Literacy Award, the McNally Robinson Best Book for Young People's Award, and was a finalist for the TD Canadian Children's Literature Award. His acclaimed YA series, The Reckoner, has won the McNally Robinson Best Book for the Young People's Award, the Michael Van Ruy Award for the genre fiction, and the Indigenous Writer of the Year Award at the High Plains Book Awards. The Barren Grounds, the first book in the middle grade, the Misua Saga series, received a starred review from Kirkus and was the Kirkus and Quill Choir Best Middle Grade Book of 2020. David is a member of the Norway House Cree Nation and currently lives in Winnipeg. I have shortened that list. There's many other books and awards that David has had. David, welcome to Our Native Land.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I always like to get started by getting to know my guests a little bit more. Obviously, I introduced yourself as an author and the books that you've done. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background, your heritage, the tribe you're from, and maybe sort of the discovery process that you went to connect to your culture through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole book about that called Blackwater.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I wanted to touch on that. So.
So I'm Cree. My dad was born and raised in Norway House Cree Nation, which is a community about 8 hours north of Winnipeg here, where I live right now. Sorry about my dog there scratching in his crate.
I was just
start again.
Maybe we'll start again. That's a pretty loud. Oh my God!
He doesn't shit in there. Okay.
Okay. I'll just re-ask that question in a way and reprime it up. Okay.
Okay.
So I always like to start off the show by getting to know my guests, David. I did touch on it, but let's get to know a bit more about your background, your culture, and connect into that culture through your work.
Right. So I live here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. My dad was born and raised in a community called Norway House Cree Nation, which is a reserve about 8 hours north of Winnipeg, depending on who's driving. I always find that we can always get to our own communities much faster than if you don't live in those communities.
Exactly.
But he was born and raised there. He lived actually the first 9 years of his life out on the land on his one of his family's trap lines. They had a few. I learned a lot from my dad about my identity as a Cree person, a Cree kid, and a Cree man. And we went on a long journey together of discovery because I grew up really disconnected from my Indigenous identity, and it's really informed my work. All those experiences. The ways in which I wasn't taught, or where the history was ignored when I was going through school or growing up, or the misrepresentations of Indigenous people in popular culture, has really informed all of the books that I've done. I write them because I want Indigenous kids to see themselves reflected in literature, and for non-Indigenous kids to read about Indigenous people in a way that's truthful, because it's not something that we had when we were growing up. And I felt like it was really important for me to do that in my own work.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back and touch base about your dad and being so inspirational, and I did heard he passed away at the beginning of 2020. So I do apologize. I do give my condolences to you. You'd mentioned in another recording that I listened to about how inspirational and how thoughtful and how progressive he was even back in the day. You talked about him graduated as a minister. Can you tell me a little bit about that story and what he taught you about, not being tokenized? I think what story I'm talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, my dad has obviously been like a huge influence on my life. Even though, when I was a kid, he and my mom were separated, and he wasn't around to teach me a lot about, my Cree identity. But at the same time, one of the things that he always taught me was that I needed to work to define myself. I needed to work to define myself based on my own experiences and my own journey. He talked a lot about this concept of non-interference, which was a part of the Cree, I think, Cree values and Cree ways of upbringing. He didn't want to impose identity on me. He wanted to role model it in his own life. And through that role modeling, help me to better understand what it meant to be Cree, but not in a way that was what would be the word now? That was subscriptive, I guess. It was in a way that would be that would just, I guess, help give me the tools that I needed to figure that out for myself. And so it's been I was able to learn from him for about 30 years. And he was the best teacher you could possibly ask for. And Dad in a lot of ways broke the mold. He lived traditionally. He was a recognized elder in the circle of elders. He was grandparent and knowledge keeper, but at the same time, as you mentioned, he was also a minister. And so he walked in that way in two worlds, and was able to navigate both, because he understood that living in one way doesn't negate the value of living in another. And I think that that's an important teaching that I've grown up with, is that it never had to be the way that it was, especially in the context of residential school history. There's this whole belief that you had to abandon your identity to adapt and learn to live in another sort of society, another sort of way of life, and you didn't have to. You can have both, and you can, if you so choose, right? And so that's something that he did, and I've learned to do that in my own life. I grew up in the city. I grew up in an urban area. I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, and it didn't make me more or less Cree. No matter where I grew up, no matter what I learned, that's the thing I asked him one day. I said, "Why didn't you teach me how to be Cree?" And he said, "You are Cree. How am I going to teach you how to be Cree? You are Cree." It's just what you make of that for yourself. And nothing you do or say is going to make you more or less Cree. And I really followed that for the last several years of my life. And I think I've also found a good balance of understanding and appreciating and loving Cree ways of living and traditions and values and beliefs, while also being able to navigate my way through Western society. And I feel like I've been pretty successful at doing that, and have found what my dad has always talked about is that balance.
Well, I appreciate you touching on those topics and talking about your dad. And I've noticed, I think you found a great balance, and you got some great books and you got some great stories. And speaking of residential school, one of the books that you are quite well known for is Sugar Falls, and it does dive into the journey of residential school. And the timing of talking about this is during the time where there's been 215 children found buried at the old Kamloops residential school. So when you were writing this book, was it again, you're trying to inspire Indigenous youth to see themselves in a literature sense, or in an author's role, but also to educate other children? So do you find that your book is still teaching people? Was that the main goal?
Yeah, the main goal of all my books are education. It's something that my dad was a really prominent educator in Canada, in the area of Indigenous education. My mom was a teacher. So I've always understood the importance of education. I've also understood what's gone wrong in education in historically in Canada, especially in terms of Indigenous history, peoples, cultures, whether it was ignored or told by somebody else. And so all my books have been with the express intent of using them in the classroom as resources for teachers, so that teachers have a hard job. We've asked them to do a lot of work, especially in the last 5-10 years, in the area of, for example, residential school history, and we haven't prepared them for it. They haven't been educated themselves on how to educate others and how to educate kids. And so they, as much as they want to do it properly, as much as they want to do it in the right way, in a good way, they haven't been prepared adequately to do it. And so books help. And one of the things I tell, because I do a lot of professional development with teachers, is that you have to learn yourself first before you're able to teach somebody else. Mm-hmm. And so, my books, hopefully, and I think I've seen that over the last 10 years, have been used to both educate teachers about things like residential school history, and then have been used as a resource in classrooms to teach children about residential school history at all age levels. So whether it's Sugar Falls or When We Were Alone or Seven Generations. Sugar Falls is one of the first graphic novels about residential schools in Canada, and When We Were Alone was one of the first picture books for residential schools in Canada, and I think I'm glad to see that there's so many more now today that are being written and available, because stories are the ways in which we really are going to learn and reach kids and generate empathy, so that they can move forward in a better way, and when they get in leadership positions, make better decisions than have been made in the past in this country by leaders that did not have access to the knowledge that kids have today.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important attribute to a lot of Indigenous books, is that just I think by default becoming educational. I think even if a lot of Indigenous authors that are writing different experiences and heritage and cultural teachings, it might not sometimes intentionally be educational, but I think it's inevitable, to be honest. I want to get back to a little bit before you were an author and sort of your inspirational. What were your ideas of an author before you were an author, and what was that journey like? What was that moment where you decided that this is the kind of career that I want to have?
Oh, I was 8. So
you were 8.
It was wow. It was a long time ago.
We're going way back. Yeah.
This is like what you call a deep cut. This is a deep cut. I was in grade 3. I was 8 years old, and I started to write poetry in class, and just fell in love with it. My teacher made these poems that I had written into a book, like printed them out on like a Commodore 64, and printed them out onto like with a dot matrix printer, and staple bound it. And I held this book, and I just felt so proud that I'd made this book, and went home to my mom that day and said, "Mom, I want to be a writer." And ever since that day, I've only ever wanted to be a writer. I didn't give myself any other outs, and I've worked hard, to get where I am today. But it's been 36 years that I've had this dream of writing books, and initially it was just like the act of creation. Like I think that I just loved making something out of nothing, and which is true of like anything in the arts, whether it's dance or music or illustrations or writing. You're creating something that it has some sort of intrinsic value, because art is storytelling. And I really have loved and appreciate that about art since I was a child. And now it's just like, where am I going to focus that storytelling? What kind of message do I want to work into the stories that I write? And that's what I think most about when I write books, is not just the plot, but what am I actually trying to say, and what value is there in what I'm trying to say for readers, no matter whether it's adults or children.
Mm-hmm. And how are you managing to do that? So it sounds like out of shock, but you're doing it so efficiently, because I know you got about 4 to 5 projects that you're working at any given time. So are you touching on every them a little bit every day? Do you focus on one at a time, sort of for maybe some young and upcoming writers have a general sense of what process works for you?
Google Calendar, you have to you do, because I have 5 kids, so
Yeah.
you really have to schedule out your time,
Yep.
and figure out when you're going to work on what, so, and I have a day job too. So, I work usually on one project in the morning, before the kids are up. I'll get up maybe, like 6 a.m. and I'll write or edit for a little bit. And then when the kids are in bed, I usually write for an hour or so, and I'll never work on the same project at the same time, because you really do need to be in a different headspace. So, whether I'm working on a picture book, you can't just transition so quickly like that into like working on a memoir, for example. You really have to think about and let the story percolate, and then get yourself into the right headspace and then dive into it. So I separate my time. I schedule out the time when I'm going to write. I have quotas that I try and reach. So like whether it's word count or pages, whatever it might be. And you just really work meticulously and methodically in that way, because it really is a job. Like and as much as I get a lot of joy out of it, it is work. So and just like this, stuff like this is work, like, going to classrooms and visiting kids, doing PE sessions with teachers. That's part of the job too. So you just have to be able to, I think, again, it's like finding balance so that you can, really, self-care, take care of yourself, not overdo it, which I've done a lot over the past few years.
Yeah.
And then just, make sure that you're scheduling your time well enough so you can get projects done when they're supposed to be done, so you don't get in trouble from your publisher.
Yeah, exactly. They got some time frames for you for sure. Yeah, I want to touch again a little bit about balance as well too, because you had mentioned before publicly about your dad really demonstrating the idea that you're human first, and how you decide to navigate your Indigenous culture and your ways and mix it with Western society is definitely your charge and your journey that you're responsible for taking action upon. So what is the significance of being Indigenous and being an author and navigating the publishing world? Like how is there enough opportunity for Indigenous people to be able to, again, be human in this platform, but also be very have the freedom to express their Indigenous background at the same time?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the best teachings my dad gave me was you sit me down and say, within the context of reconciliation or anything, we have to see each other on a human level first. Like we're all human beings, and then we have to be able to see through these sort of stereotypes and perceptions that we've been fed and that we've been inundated with in popular culture, in the media, and just be able to see each other as human beings, and then work to learn about each other, to hear each other's stories, to read each other's stories, so that I can really get to know you. And I think that's what we all need to work towards. And so, yeah, so it's, and it's really, for me, it's informed the way in which I write and the way in which I, go about my work as a public speaker too. It's recognizing that, we're all human beings. We share similarities and we have differences, and those differences make us stronger as a community. They don't, they shouldn't, create any sort of separation between us. They should actually bring us together and make us, stronger. A diverse community is much more, I think, much more powerful than a monolith, right? So it's like we're not the same, and right now there's such a hunger to learn about each other in Canada and across North America. In particular with Indigenous stories, or I would just say like with BIPOC stories, from the Black community, from the Indigenous community, from the Asian community. Canadians really want to read diverse stories. They really want to read diverse literature. So in terms of being like an Indigenous writer right now, it's probably the best time in Canadian history to be an Indigenous writer, because people want to read our literature. They want to read our stories. They really have a thirst to learn. I really believe that. Like the majority of Canadians are incredible. Like they really want to learn. They have good hearts, and they know that they haven't been they haven't learned in a good way for so long, and they really want to know the history. They really want to understand the impacts of it, and so on the other side of it, publishers, because they are a business, they know that readers want to read Indigenous stories, and they know that they can make money off of it because when people want to read it, they buy the books, and so more and more publishers are looking to Indigenous authors to bring them stories. And so it's a really exciting time to be an Indigenous writer, because not only because so many are finding success, but more importantly, so many are reading their stories and learning from them. So if any given week, if you look at this, for example, the CBC bestseller list, at least 30% or more of them are all Indigenous writers.
Which I don't think you could say that a couple years ago.
No, you couldn't. You couldn't at all. But yeah, if you look down the list from like fiction to nonfiction to children's literature, there's at least sometimes even half of them are from Indigenous writers, and so it's there. Like, and it's a really good time to write stories. And that's what I tell emerging writers. Like, we need your stories. The publishers are looking to publish your stories, and just work on your craft and find your voice, and then you'll have a platform.
Absolutely. And we don't have too much time, but I did want to touch on one more thing. You did mention it at the beginning of the last question about reconciliation itself. You've been known to find that really nice balance of educating people about reconciliation through your writing, and I wanted to, if you can expand on the idea of teaching reconciliation in a way that is talking about the trauma, but there's also more than just the trauma of reconciliation. You've been quoted in really defining that really beautifully. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that.
One of the things that I did in my earlier career was really trauma-based literature. It was trauma-based storytelling, and that's important. People need to learn the history, and the history was traumatic. We have been through hell and back as Indigenous people. Like, oftentimes, when we have writers right now writing in dystopian fiction who are Indigenous, they say we've been through the apocalypse as Indigenous people. We've survived it, and so that's been really important to be able to talk about this trauma. But in the last few years of my career, I've moved away from solely trauma-based stories, because I believe that it's just as important to learn about strength, resiliency, culture, language, community, as it is to learn about trauma. And sometimes they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they go hand in hand. Trauma and resiliency, for example. But sometimes you can just tell a story about culture and community, and there doesn't have to be a whiff of trauma in there. And I think that is there is as much value as that, because I think that there's a tendency in reading stories that are solely trauma-based to just re-victimize ourselves and to be viewed as victims. Absolutely. And the reality is that we are a strong people, and we have been through a lot, but we have come out the other end. And there has been a resurgence of culture and language in this country that is a really beautiful thing. And I think literature is beginning to reflect that and understand that we need more stories than just trauma. No, those trauma stories are very important, but there is more to it than that. And we need to, I think a lot of writers are embracing that, and I certainly have in my work.
Yeah, no, I think you have, and you found a really great balance, and I think that's part of the reason why people are so receptive to your literature, and your list of awards definitely really back up the quality of your work. So it's like I said when I was first introducing you, I had to cut it down. You have so many people that have really taken to your books, and very, very well, very good list of accolades. So I appreciate your work, and I'm excited to dive into more of your books. That's for sure.
Thank you. Well, I lose more than I win, just so you know. But
Okay.
That's totally fine. You have to be able to take the L's too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, I know you have a busy schedule, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on the show and talk about your books and educating us a bit more about your culture and your Cree background and talk about your great book. So thank you so much for coming on to Our Native Land.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Take care.